Montana Territory, late spring of 1878, the wind rolled over the dry grass like it carried secrets. But when Paxton O'Rourke rode into town with 2 children and a rifle strapped to his back, he was not here for whispers. He was looking for a teacher. The town of Ash Hollow was too small for anything proper. No schoolhouse, no preacher, barely a general store, but it was the nearest place with people, and Paxton had 2 children who deserved better than dust and silence. He tied his horse outside the mercantile, helped his daughter down first. "Careful, Zelly," he said, brushing her dark curls from her face. She was 9, quiet, and still carried the wide-eyed look of a child who had lost too much too fast. Her younger brother, Zeke, was 5 and clung to Paxton's leg the moment he touched the ground. The shopkeeper, a balding older man named Mayer, raised his brow when Paxton stepped in. "Back again, O'Rourke. Looking for someone," Paxton said, setting down a tin of coffee and glancing toward the bulletin board. "Heard there might be a woman passing through." "Said she knew how to teach reading." "She left," Mayer said. "Left this morning, walked out with nothing but a satchel, real quiet. Said she was heading east, maybe to Fort Benton." "Walked," Paxton frowned. "Why?" The shopkeeper hesitated. Her boarding house host caught her reading. "Said she was defying her place. Beat her near senseless before she slipped out." Paxton's jaw tightened. He turned and strode out without another word. It took him 2 hours to find her. He spotted her near the edge of the river trail, limping, one arm bruised and clutched against her ribs, her bonnet torn. She flinched when he rode closer, eyes wide beneath the rim. Her dress was dusty, blood dried at her collar. "Ma'am," Paxton said, voice low. "You the one who was teaching kids to read?" She hesitated, then gave a nod. "I am not here to hurt you," he said. "I got 2 children, both abandoned by their mother last winter. They need someone who knows what learning means. I can offer safety, food." "A roof." She looked up at him properly then. Her eyes were pale green, swollen at the edges, but steady. "Why would you trust a stranger with your children?" "Because they deserve more than I can give," he said. "And because I do not take kindly to men who beat women for knowing more than they do." She blinked. Then, after a breath, she said, "My name's Kensey Judd." "Paxton O'Rourke," he said, dismounting. "Let me help you onto the horse." She tried to climb up herself, but winced sharply and nearly fell. He caught her before she hit the ground. She stiffened but did not pull away. "I can ride," she muttered. "I believe you," he said, "but I am not asking you to prove anything." With gentle care, he lifted her into the saddle and walked beside her the rest of the way back. The ranch sat 3 miles out from town, tucked near the base of the low hills. It was not much, just a 2-room cabin, a barn and wide sky, but it was quiet and safe, and the children ran out when they saw him coming. Zelly froze when she spotted Kensey. "This is Miss Judd," Paxton said, squatting beside his daughter. "She is going to help you learn things I cannot teach." Zeke peeked out from behind Zelly, thumb in his mouth. Kensey dismounted slowly and knelt, even though it clearly hurt. "Hello," she said gently. "You both have kind eyes." Neither child answered, but Zeke crept closer. That night, Paxton made stew and watched as Kensey sat with the children near the fire. She read softly from an old almanac, her voice uneven but soothing. Zelly leaned against her after an hour. Zeke fell asleep in her lap. Paxton stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching the firelight flicker across her face. She looked different now, still bruised but not broken. "Why did you learn to read?" he asked, voice low. She glanced up. "My mother taught me in secret. We would hide under quilts with candle stubs." She said reading was the only thing that ever made her feel free. He nodded slowly. "Most folks around here would not agree." "I know," she said. "But I would not stop, even when my husband found out, even when her voice cracked." She looked away. Paxton stepped closer. "You are safe here. I will never let anyone hurt you again." She met his eyes, and something shifted between them, not loud, not sudden, just a quiet understanding. A beginning. The next morning, Kensey woke to the smell of fresh bread and the sound of Zeke laughing. She sat up slowly. Her ribs still ached, but the pain was dull now. Manageable. In the kitchen, Paxton was helping Zelly knead dough while Zeke played with scraps of cloth near the table. Kensey watched a moment before stepping in. "I can help," she said. Paxton looked over his shoulder and smiled not wide, just enough to reach his eyes. You already are. Days passed and then weeks. Kensey taught the children every morning, sitting with them in the sun near the porch steps. Zelly was sharp, eager. Zeke took longer, but he smiled more often now. Paxton watched them from the barn, his heart twisting in ways he had not expected. He had not brought her here for himself. He had meant only to offer safety. But the way Kensey looked at the children, the way she read with her fingers brushing the pages like they were sacred, stirred something deep in him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the kids were asleep, Paxton stepped out onto the porch where Kensey sat with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked softly. "For giving them something I could not." She looked at him, long and honest. "You gave them love, Paxton. That is more than most ever get." He sat beside her, close but not too close. "You have changed this place." "I never thought I would feel safe again," she whispered, "but I do here, with you." He reached for her hand. She let him. Her fingers were small, warm. They sat that way for a long while. Neither spoke. The stars filled the sky like blessings, and Paxton knew, without needing to say it, that something had begun, something real, something worth holding on to. They hauled the last of the winter-dried wood into the lean-to behind the barn before the next storm rolled in. Paxton handed Kensey a split log, and she stacked it without wincing this time. The bruises along her ribs had faded to faint shadows. She moved easier now, though her left arm still stiffened in the morning chill. "You're keeping pace," he said. "I was raised around timber," she replied, brushing a pine needle from her skirt. "My father split oak for a living. I used to carry kindling in my skirts just to prove I could." He leaned on the axe handle, watching her with quiet admiration. "You prove plenty," Zelly's voice rang out from the house. "Miss Judd, Zeke won't sit still for his pen work." Kensey tipped her head toward the porch. "Sounds like my next battle. You want me to talk to him?" She shook her head. "No, if I give in now, he'll never take me serious again." He watched her stride toward the house, braids swinging low on her back, and felt something heavy and warm settle in his chest. What began as necessity had turned to something else, though neither of them had spoken it plain. That night, a squall swept in from the west. Wind battered the shutters and rain tapped the roof like fingers seeking entry. The fire seemed to shrink in the hearth, and Zelly curled close to Kensey on the floor, her slate tucked beneath her arm. Paxton sat at the table, mending the strap on his saddle. He glanced at Kensey, her face golden in the firelight. "Your father," he said. "What became of him?" She smoothed Zelly's hair, quiet a moment. "He drowned crossing the Sabine. I was 13. My mother died the next spring of lung fever." He set the saddle strap down. "You had no brothers, none that lived past infancy. You were alone then." "I married the first man who offered me a name," she said. "He was older, thought I'd be grateful forever." Paxton didn't speak right away. The wind howled through the gaps in the window frame. "What did he do when he found your books?" She looked at him, eyes unreadable. "He burned them. Every page, and then he made sure I remembered why he had the right." Paxton stood, walked to the hearth, and stirred the coals. He added a split log to the flames. "You're not under any man's right here, Kensey." She met his gaze. "I know that now." When the wind eased, he took an extra quilt from the trunk and laid it over the children. Zelly was already asleep, one small hand tucked into Kensey's skirt. "You ought to have the bed," he said. "You're still healing." "I'll take the floor beside them. They've had too much, leave them already." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll set my bedroll near the door." In the early hours, Paxton woke to coughing, not loud but hoarse and dry. Kensey sat up, pressing a cloth to Zeke's mouth. The boy didn't cry, only whimpered between breaths. Paxton knelt beside them. "He warm," she touched Zeke's cheek. "A little, he was fine at dusk." "We've got horehound and molasses in the pantry," Paxton said. "I'll steep it strong." By lantern light, Kensey held Zeke against her chest, humming tunelessly while Paxton brewed the remedy. The boy's breathing steadied by dawn. Kensey hadn't slept at all. After the sun rose, Paxton found her on the porch, hands wrapped around a tin cup. Her braid had loosened and her shoulders sagged. "You stayed up all night," he said. "I've done worse," she replied, "but I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed." He sat beside her, elbows on his knees. "I don't want you to forget," she turned, expression soft. "You're not what I expected out here. I don't know what I am half the time, but I know I want you here." The words hung between them, quiet and solid as fence posts. She touched his arm. "Then don't shut me out when the hard days come." "I won't," he said. "Not ever." Inside, Zeke stirred and called for her. Kensey rose, but not before resting her hand on Paxton's shoulder, gentle, lingering. When she disappeared through the door, he stared out at the hills, heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. The woman he'd brought home out of necessity had become the center of something he hadn't known he was building, and he wasn't afraid of it. Not anymore. By mid-June, the hills had greened with late rain, and wild mustard crept up around the fence posts. Kensey stood barefoot in the garden rows, pinching back early sprouts of squash. Every so often, she'd straighten and press a hand to her back, moving slower than she used to, but steady. Paxton leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're pushing too hard. I'm planting for 4, she said without looking up, "and this soil's stubborn." He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching dry earth. "You don't owe me anything, Kensey." She wiped her hands on her skirt and met his eyes. "I'm not doing it for you." Paxton didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to the rows she'd laid out neat, measured, like she was building something worth lasting. "I had a sister once," he said finally. "Maggie, 2 years younger than me. She used to plant onions so deep they never sprouted." Kensey tilted her head. "Where is she now?" "Died in Kansas. Fever took most of the wagon train. I buried her near a dry creek." Kensey stepped closer, her voice quieter. "You've carried too many graves. So have you." They stood there a moment, the garden warm with the scent of turned soil and growing things. Then Zelly called from the house, something about a spilled ink jar, and Kensey turned to go. That night, after the children slept, Paxton brought out a leather-wrapped box from an old cedar chest. He laid it on the table between them. "I want to show you something." Kensey hesitated before untying the cord. Inside lay a stack of yellowed pages, ledgers, maps, hand-drawn diagrams of irrigation channels and crop cycles. "This land's dry most years," he said, "but there's a spring under the south ridge. If I build the trenches right, we could run water through the lower field." She studied the sketches, tracing the pencil lines with her finger. "You've had this planned for years," he said. "I just never had reason to finish it." She looked up. "And you do now," he nodded once. "I want to build something that lasts, Kensey, not just for the children, for us." She didn't speak at first, only closed the box and slid it back toward him. Then she reached out and laid her hand over his. "I never thought I'd be part of someone's plan again," she said. "But I'd like to help you finish it." The next morning, they packed the wagon with tools and followed the trail around the ridge. Zelly held tight to her slate board, humming softly, while Zeke clutched a pine cone like it was treasure. At the spring, Paxton showed Kensey where the water came up clear and cold, tucked among chokecherry bushes. She knelt beside it, dipping her fingers in. "It's cleaner than I expected," she said. "It runs straight down from the foothills. Never dries, even in August." They spent the afternoon marking where the trench would go. Zelly and Zeke chased grasshoppers between the sage, and Kensey used a thin switch to draw lines in the dirt. As the sun dipped low, Paxton offered her a hand to climb back into the wagon. She took it without hesitation. On the ride home, Zeke fell asleep on her lap. Kensey rested her cheek against his hair, and Paxton found himself watching the way her face softened in the fading light. "You ever thought about marrying again?" he asked, voice low. She didn't startle, didn't look away from the boy in her arms. "I used to think I couldn't, that I wasn't someone a man could want without hurting." Paxton kept his eyes on the trail. "I'd never raise a hand to you." "I know," she said. Then, after a pause, "I've thought about it more lately." He waited. She looked at him then, steady and sure. "If I ever did, it would be with a man who lets me plant what I want, read when I need to, and speak without fear." "You'd have all of that here," he said. "And more." The wagon creaked on through the dusk. Neither rushed the silence that followed. Later, as they settled the children into bed, Zelly tugged Kensey's apron and whispered, "Will you still be here when the snow comes?" Kensey bent low, brushing a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "Yes, sweetheart, I will." In the doorway, Paxton watched with quiet certainty. The wind picked up outside, rustling the cottonwoods, but inside the cabin, everything held still, solid. Rooted, when Kensey stood, she crossed to him slowly. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I want you here, Kensey Judd," he said. She nodded once. "Then let's build this life together." No more words were needed. The fire burned low, and the night folded in around them, soft, warm, and finally whole. By late July, the trench had reached the edge of the lower pasture, and Kensey's hands were browned from sun and soil. She stood beside Paxton as he hammered the last of the guide stakes into place, sweat darkening the back of his collar. Zelly and Zeke watched from the shade of the elm, tracing shapes into the dust with sticks. "You'll be able to run water by first harvest," she said, brushing grit from her palms. "If the flow holds," Paxton replied, eyeing the slope. "I'll dam it careful. Won't risk it flooding the roots." Kensey crouched to check the alignment of a wooden channel. "You ever think about putting in fruit trees?" He glanced over. "Not enough time to tend them before, but with the extra hands." She looked up at him, dust streaking her cheek, and smiled, not with shyness or uncertainty, but with the quiet assurance of someone who no longer felt like a visitor. That night, the children stayed over at the McAllister place, an arrangement made a week prior so Kensey and Paxton could ride into Deer Lodge for supplies. It was the first time they'd been alone off the ranch together. The ride took them through gulch country, where the hills rose steep and red-veined, and the wind carried the scent of sage and iron. Kensey rode bare-headed, her bonnet tucked beneath her belt, letting the breeze play through strands that had slipped from her braid. "You always this quiet when you're not teaching?" Paxton asked, shifting the reins in one hand. "I think better when I keep my mouth shut," she said. "You think I don't notice when you're studying folks like you're reading them?" She turned her head. "I reckon you're not easy to read. Maybe I don't want to be, then you're making a poor show of it." He looked at her sidelong, and something passed between them. Not teasing, not coy, just a shared understanding that whatever was forming between them had weight. They reached Deer Lodge by midday, tied their horses near the livery, and stepped into the dry shade of the mercantile. Inside, Kensey moved with purpose, checking flour sacks for weevils and rejecting tins with dented seams. Paxton followed her lead, watching the way she read labels with her fingertip. "Never seen someone inspect molasses like it's gunpowder," he said. "Last batch I bought was half crystal and tasted like boot leather." He handed her a different jar. "This one's from the Bitterroot Valley. Storekeeper says it's clean. Then we'll take two." As Kensey counted coins at the counter, a woman near the bolts of calico gave her a long once-over, whispering to the man beside her. Kensey felt it, but didn't flinch. Outside, Paxton noticed. "You know her?" "No," Kensey said, loading the sack into the wagon. "But she knew me. You want to talk about it?" "I'd rather not." He didn't press. They camped that night 2 miles south of the ranch, beneath a stand of juniper. The stars came out clear and sharp, and the fire snapped gently between them. Kensey sat cross-legged on a blanket, rolling tobacco for Paxton while he sharpened a knife. "I was thinking," she said, "if I planted hops near the barn wall, they'd climb the siding and shade the loft." He looked up. "You planning to brew something I don't know about?" "No," she said, twisting the paper between her fingers. "Just like the smell of them, reminds me of my mother's garden." He took the roll from her, lit it with a stick from the fire, and passed it back. "She grow anything else," borage and mint, and once a lemon balm that never did take. She said Montana had no patience for southern herbs. He leaned back on one hand. "You'd make her proud." Kensey looked into the fire. "I'd like to think she'd see something in this life I'm trying to build. That she wouldn't ask why I stayed. She'd see it," he said. "Anyone would." She turned toward him, her face half lit by firelight. "And you, Paxton, you still thinking this is what you want?" He didn't hesitate. "Every morning I wake up and you're still here, I'm surer than the day before." She reached for his hand. "Then come stand with me in front of the preacher next time we're in town." Paxton's fingers tightened around hers. "You asking me to marry you?" "I am," she said. "Because I've had choices taken from me before, but this one's mine." He nodded, voice rough. "Then yes, Kensey Judd, I'll stand beside you." They didn't kiss, not yet, but their hands stayed joined until the fire burned low and the stars began to fade. At dawn, they rode home through silver fog, the wagon light and their hearts full. The ranch came into view just as the mist lifted from the pasture, and the children burst from the porch the moment they heard the wagon creak. Zelly ran to Kensey, flinging her arms around her waist. "You came back." "I told you I would," Kensey said, holding her close. Paxton lifted Zeke onto his shoulder. The boy grinned, pointing at the sack slung across the wagon bed. "Got molasses?" he asked. "We got more than that," Paxton said, meeting Kensey's gaze. And in that morning light, with the earth still damp from night and the house warm with waiting, the shape of their future came clear. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. Fully and finally, the preacher's house stood on the far edge of Ash Hollow, perched near the cottonwoods that bordered the creek. He was a wiry man with calloused hands and a voice that rasped like worn leather, but he welcomed them without hesitation when Paxton knocked at his door. They stood on the porch, the morning sun rising behind them, Kensey in a faded blue dress with her hair pinned back in a simple coil. Zelly clutched a ribbon in her hand, and Zeke had a handful of wildflowers, roots and all, bundled in twine. "We don't need anything fancy," Paxton said, "just the words." The preacher nodded once. "That's all a marriage needs." The ceremony took place under the cottonwoods, with the breeze threading softly through the leaves. Kensey didn't look at the preacher when he spoke. Her eyes stayed on Paxton, steady and full of quiet promise. When she said yes, her voice was low, but it didn't tremble. When Paxton answered, his hand closed around hers like it had always belonged there. Zeke ran in circles afterward, waving his flower bundle until the petals scattered across the grass. Zelly stood beside Kensey, her fingers laced into the folds of her skirt. "You're really my stepmother now?" she asked. Kensey bent down. "Only if you want me to be," Zelly nodded. "I do." They rode home slow, the wagon rattling over the dry path, the sun warm on their backs. Kensey sat close beside Paxton, her hip brushing his with each sway of the wheels. He reached for her hand without a word, and she leaned against him, her head resting just below his shoulder. That evening, Paxton brought out a jar of blackberry preserves he'd been saving since the previous fall, and Kensey fried cornmeal cakes on the griddle. The children sat at the table, legs swinging, eyes bright. After supper, they walked the edge of the pasture, bare feet in the cool grass. Paxton carried Zeke on his shoulders, and Kensey held Zelly's hand as they moved through the hush of dusk. A kite hawk circled above, wings wide, and a coyote called faintly from the distant hills. "You were right," Kensey said as they watched the sun dip behind the far ridge. "This land has a kind of promise in it." Paxton glanced at her, brow lifted. "You doubted me, I doubted myself." She smiled then, not fleeting or uncertain, but full, but not anymore. That night they lay side by side in the bed Paxton had built before the children were born. The room held the scent of clean linen and wood smoke. Kensey shifted onto her side, fingers resting softly against his chest. "When I first came here," she said, "I didn't think I'd stay. I thought I might leave in the night once I was strong enough." "I know," he said. But something changed. He brushed a strand of hair from her brow, his touch unhurried. "You let yourself be seen." She was quiet a moment then. "I want to grow old here. With you, you will," he whispered. "Right here with me." And when he kissed her, it wasn't urgent. It was steady and sure, the kind of kiss that came not from longing, but from peace. Paxton rose early the next morning and found Kensey already outside, her hands deep in the earth near the barn wall, setting down the first of the hop shoots. She looked up when he stepped out, dirt smudged across her cheek. "They'll take root better if I start them now," she said. He crouched beside her. "You think we've got enough time before the frost, if I'm careful," she said, "and if the water trench holds." It did. Paxton finished the channel work that week, and by late summer, the lower fields stayed green even when the high sun baked the rest of the range. The garden pushed up strong, and they planted more beans, turnips, even a row of onions for Zelly, who wanted to test her own luck. Kensey started keeping a journal in the evenings, not out of habit, but to mark the turning of their days. She never read it aloud, but Paxton saw the way her mouth curved while she wrote, like the words had settled something inside her. In September, the McAllisters brought over a milk goat as a wedding gift, and Kensey built a small pen beside the chicken coop. Zelly named the goat Hazel, and Zeke insisted it preferred his singing. By first frost, the hops had stretched halfway up the barn siding, thin tendrils curling around the boards. Kensey stood with one hand resting on her belly, watching the wind lift the last leaves from the cottonwoods behind the house. Paxton stepped out and joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You feeling all right?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "But good, it's strange, isn't it, how quiet joy can be?" He kissed the side of her head. "Doesn't have to be loud to be real." They stayed that way as the morning warmed, with the sky clear and high above them, and the land around them full of small, steady life. Years passed. The ranch held. The spring never dried. The children grew, learned to read and write and plant and reckon. Zelly became a teacher herself, and Zeke took to the land like it answered only to him. Paxton and Kensey added a second room to the cabin, then a third. They never left, never needed to. Kensey's hair turned silver at the temples, and Paxton walked slower in winter, but they still rose together each morning to the sound of wind through the grass and the soft stir of a house built with care. And every evening, as the sun fell behind the pasture, they held hands on the porch, their fingers worn but always laced, their hearts strong with all they had built together.